And with that, I would like to ask Professor Magocsi to begin our fourth session, and we have come to the topic of Ukrainian history and its the significance of Holodomor research.
Good morning, and welcome, as Frank said, to the fourth session. So in any case, the fourth session, as you see, is dealing with the impact. What impact has the study of the Holodomor had on our understanding of Ukrainian history? And we have two distinguished panelists today. The main address, if you will, the main talk will be presented by Olga Andriewsky, who completed her PhD at Harvard, but like many people from the South have migrated to the North, and she has been here since 1991 at Trent University, where she is now an associate professor of history, author of several scholarly articles, and certainly has much experience speaking in a wide range of venues. So I'm sure we will be well served today by her oral presentation. The commentator to my left is Serhii Plokhii, migrated not from the south but from the east, but also first to Canada, but then decided to migrate south, where he holds the Mikhailo Hrushevsky Chair of Ukrainian History at Harvard University, a very well-known and now highly esteemed author of numerous monographs on Ukrainian intellectual history, in particular nationality questions, historiography, an award-winning book on Yalta, and most recently a book on the Cossack myth. So we really look forward to today's presentations, and may I ask Professor Andriewsky to take the floor or the podium as you wish.
Before I begin, I'd like to thank the organizers of the conference for, first of all, coming up with such an interesting format, for inviting such a wonderful group of senior scholars, and for bringing in such a lively group, an interesting group of young scholars who have really added a whole different dimension to the proceedings. I'd like to, in particular, single out HREC, the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium, and especially Marta Baziuk and Andriy Makukh for their very generous assistance. They're not only terrific organizers, but are themselves deeply committed to the Holodomor project. And as someone who actually lives in Toronto, I know how hard both of them have worked, and they deserve our special thanks. I'd like to, well, first I'll preface my talk by saying my paper was written before the conference, and it was written before I had read any of the other papers. So if you see certain themes that are repeated from yesterday, I'm not simply imitating what was said. I'd like to begin by defining who we are, or rather how I use the term, and by we I mean professional historians whose work focuses on Ukraine. And this sounds very neat. It's not. It's a really artificial distinction. In particular, the boundaries of what constitutes Soviet history and Ukrainian history and the differences between them are completely blurred. That is, there are historians like Lynn Viola and Terry Martin, whose books, I would argue, and I actually will argue, have had a profound understanding on our profound implications for our understanding of Ukrainian history. Yet neither Lynn Viola nor Terry Martin would consider themselves as historians of Ukraine. There are other historians like Hiroaki Kuromiya, whose work has focused almost exclusively on Ukraine in the 1920s and 30s, and yet his work is treated as kind of case histories of Soviet history rather than Ukrainian history per se. But let's leave aside these complicating issues, and for the purposes of our presentation, we'll assume that and pretend that these distinctions are very clear and obvious. What I'd like to do this morning is focus in my presentation on the state of the field. I'm actually going to take a very different approach from that taken by the presenters yesterday. I want to look at the questions that were posed to us by the conference organizers, which I interpreted in a slightly different way. That is, what have we learned about the Holodomor, and how has our understanding of the Holodomor changed our understanding of Ukrainian history? My aim is actually to talk about general trends in historiography and breakthroughs in research. There is by now a vast literature on the subject. It's estimated something like 15,000 items have been published, not scholarly, but in general, relating to the Holodomor. And I'm not going to pretend that I've read all of them. I'm actually not a specialist on the Holodomor. My specialty is late 19th, early 20th century, and so I come as kind of a visitor to this subject from another time. I'm not going to talk about popular conceptions of and representations of the Holodomor. That's a separate topic, and it certainly merits serious discussion. It's worth noting, I think, however, that the study of the Holodomor is an issue of great public interest, both in the diaspora and in the Ukraine. And it sort of makes working in the field of Ukrainian history very different. There is an audience out there, a public audience, for what we do. Survivors in Canada, survivors of the Holodomor in Canada and the United States and Ukraine, they didn't simply wait passively for historians to begin studying what had happened to them in the late 20s and early 30s. They began recording their experiences decades before Robert Conquest's landmark study, Harvest of Sorrow, was published in 1986. And this is one of the most famous of the publications, The Black Deeds of the Kremlin, which came out on the 20th anniversary of the Holodomor and was published in Toronto. Similarly, in Ukraine, it was, I would argue, pressure from below in the late 1980s that broke more than half a century of official silence on the Holodomor. In 1988, as Stanislav Krychitsky and others have noted, it was Ukrainian writers, Ivan Drach, Boris Olinik, Alexander Musienko, Yuri Shcherbak, who first raised the issue in public of the famine and the deaths of millions of Ukrainians in the early 1930s. What's interesting and often overlooked, too, is that beginning in 1989, throughout Ukraine, in Poltava, in Kharkiv, in Kyiv, in Vinnytsia, in Zhytomyr, in Dnipropetrovsk, in Luhansk Oblast, memorials for the victims began to appear spontaneously in villages and towns. This is one of the most famous. It went up in 1993. It's near Lubny. It's near a site of a very renowned male monastery, and it was put up at the local initiative of a group of people. But often the memorials were simpler. The first memorials that went up, they might be a cross at the site of a known mass grave, or on the sites of churches that had been destroyed in the late 20s and 1930s. So in this respect, my point here is that the killer famine, that was a term that was used yesterday, has never been just an academic subject. It's much more than that. I also want to make clear at the outset that I'm not going to dwell on the politics of Holodomor commemoration. This, too, is a serious subject. There have been many works that have been written. Historians like to lament the politicization of the issue, but I would argue there's always been a political dimension to the study of the Holodomor from the moment that discussion of the event itself was suppressed to the creation of the U.S. Commission on the Ukrainian Famine under President Ronald Reagan in 1986. The Holodomor has been enmeshed in a kind of larger political discourse on the Soviet Union. It's an issue in which many, many institutional actors and non-institutional actors have had a stake and continue to have a stake. It's always going to be a political issue. But I do want to say a few words about the politics of Holodomor commemoration in Ukraine in recent years, because I think it has had an impact on research funding, on the writing of textbooks, on the scholarship itself. Under former President Viktor Yushchenko, who came to power in 2005 in the wake of a pro-Western Orange Revolution, the public commemoration and study of the Holodomor became a major state project. It was one of the most important projects of his presidency. What was unprecedented, every president of the Ukraine had to some degree, less or greater, supported the idea of the Holodomor and to some degree research. But with Yushchenko, it was the unprecedented scale of the effort that made a difference. He declared November 28th, in 2006, on November 28th, with Yushchenko's support, and indeed at his urging, the Parliament of Ukraine voted to recognize the Holodomor of 1932-33 as a deliberate act of genocide against the Ukrainian people. At the same time, the president launched an ambitious nationwide program of education, of research, and of commemoration. A museum in memory of the victims of the Holodomor, Nationalny Muzey Memorial Pamяти Жертв Holodomor. Note the plural, Holodomors, not one Holodomor, but the concept is meant to include the famine of 21-22 in Ukraine and the post-war famine 46-47. This museum was built on what's regarded as one of the most sacred sites in all of Ukraine, near the Pechерska Lavra, to commemorate the 75th anniversary in 2008. The teaching of the Holodomor was introduced in schools throughout Ukraine at every single level, even including military academies. National essay writing contests were organized for students at all levels of the system. It was a really far-ranging, very ambitious program. In 2006 as well, as part of this project, the Ukrainian Institute of National Memory, Ukrainский Институт национальной памяти, was established directly under the presidential administration. And the mandate of the institute was to conduct research and promote the public memory of Ukrainian history, but with special attention to the 20th century, to the national liberation struggles, to the victims of the Holodomors, again plural, and victims of political repression. For the 75th anniversary, the Institute was given the task of organizing a national book of memory. The National Book of Memory consisted of 19 volumes. There was a general volume, as well as one volume for each of the 17 oblasts, now 17 oblasts and regions that were affected by the Holodomor, plus one for the city of Kiev. In 1932, just to clarify, there were 5 oblasts in Ukraine. At the time of the famine in 32-33, there were only 5 oblasts, but the National Book of Memory was prepared, each volume was prepared by local oblast administration and followed a certain template that was created by the National Institute, so that each volume began with an introductory article by a scholar, a local scholar. There were documents relating to the events in the region, eyewitness testimony, in some cases photographs, newspaper articles. And a big part of the project was simply to try to collect the names of people who had died, the victims of the Holodomor. To date, researchers have identified the names of something like 882,000 victims of the killer famine. Now, in general, under Yushchenko, there was a significant increase in research and publications relating to the Holodomor. It's estimated that in 2007, 2008, because it was an anniversary, it was the high point of activity, and something like 260 books were published. Now, again, not all of them, many of them not scholarly books, but meant for a popular audience. So the Yushchenko presidency in this respect was a kind of tipping point, to use Malcolm Gladwell's expression. in the study and popularization and reception of the Holodomor. And they do annual polling every year in November to see what people in Ukraine think about the Holodomor. As of 2012, and this I think really does underscore what had happened under Yushchenko. 60% of the population of Ukraine now regards the Holodomor as genocide. 60%, and that percentage has been rising. I don't know what 2013 will show. 22% outright reject the idea. As Taras Kuzio mentioned yesterday, 30% think Stalin was a great leader as well. 18% have no opinion. And there are interesting rural-urban differences, too. 65% of the rural population is convinced it was a genocide. Now, in 2010, when Yanukovych became president, and came as the leader of a pro-Russian party of regions. He was Yushchenko's erstwhile rival. The Holodomor was very quickly demoted in terms of its symbolic importance, and very dramatically demoted when in April 2010 in Strasbourg, just as the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe was about to consider an amendment recognizing the Holodomor as genocide, Yanukovych made a statement in which he said, "We consider it incorrect and unjust to consider the Holodomor a fact of genocide of a certain people." He said it was a common tragedy shared by the Soviet people that claimed the lives not only of Ukrainians but Russians and Kazakhs and Belarusians as well. In July 2010, Yanukovych then appointed Valery Soldatenko, a historian and member of the Communist Party of Ukraine, as head of the Institute of National Memory, to replace Ihor Yukhnovsky, a very prominent activist, physicist, and member of Yushchenko's own party, Our Ukraine, as the director. And in fact, they dissolved the institute at one point and recreated it with a completely different administration and staff. Soldatenko, in one of his first interviews, explained that he too thought that the famine was a terrible tragedy, the result of difficult certain circumstances but not deliberate. He also made very clear that he prefers the term holod, famine, rather than Holodomor. So under Soldatenko, the Institute of National Memory has shifted its focus away from researching the Holodomor and done much more in other areas of Ukrainian history, most notably the Kazakh period and the Second World War. Now, as Alex Motel has pointed out, Yanukovych's interpretation of the Holodomor seems to be evolving. He hasn't used the word genocide, but he does use the word Holodomor. He doesn't use holod, he uses Holodomor. And in 2012, he sort of surprised people by, in his annual address, by referring to the Holodomor as a crime. In preparation for the upcoming 80th anniversary this November, the president has once again surprised observers. He's instructed the cabinet of ministers to ensure that the date is suitably marked throughout Ukraine, including in all educational institutions. And he's ordered the completion of the monument to the victims of the Holodomor in Washington, D.C., which was an initiative of Viktor Yushchenko. He's directed the government to support the Academy of Sciences in carrying out a program of research on the Holodomors of the early 20th century. And I leave it to my colleagues from Ukraine to explain the implications of this presidential decree for their work. So now let's turn to our main question. What have we learned? Well, obviously, there's been a profound transformation in the study of the Holodomor since the late 1980s. Perhaps more accurately, it's the world in which the Holodomor is studied that has changed so profoundly. So the Soviet Union no longer exists. Archives were opened, completely opened for a brief period of time. The center of research has shifted from North America to Ukraine itself, and we now finally have a critical body of research, of scholarship on the subject. 30 years ago, I think we could have counted on one hand the number of people who were working on some aspect of the terror famine of 32-33, Robert Conquest, Jim Mace, Roman Savin, Markot Savinnik, and Serhii Maksudov, the demographer. Jim Mace was the only historian working in all of the United States on this subject. And he was the first, and for a very long time, the only historian to go on record stating categorically that the famine of 32-33 constituted genocide. That was the conclusion in 1988 of the U.S. Commission of the Ukrainian Famine in Washington, D.C., which he headed. So that was 1988. Today, there's a substantial cohort of professional historians. There are a large and growing list of publications. We now have something like 5,000 interviews with Holodomor survivors. Over 250 collections of documents have been assembled and published. Even opponents of the concept of the Holodomor as genocide now concede, and Soldatenko first and foremost, that this has become the standard historical narrative in Ukraine. The Holodomor is genocide. And even the widespread use of the term Holodomor itself, rather than famine, tells us, I think, how much has changed. In retrospect, I think it's remarkable that how well the conclusions that Jim Mace arrived at in the U.S. Commission report to Congress in April 1988 have held up over time. And I'm not going to go over them, but I do have on the table there the findings. It's 18 points. I don't consider the last three, which really have more to do with Western, with foreign policy. But the conclusions, the findings of this commission, in many ways, I think, set the agenda for research on the Holodomor for a whole generation of historians. The questions he raised regarding intentions, policy, practice were taken up by historians subsequently. And I don't mean here to belittle the amount of research that's been done. There's been a tremendous amount of research over the last 2 decades. I think it's precisely because of the research that has been done that Mace's own findings have remain relevant today. Well, what have we learned? Here are what I regard some of the key discoveries and developments in recent years with reference to Mace's original findings. And the list is not exhaustive. I'm sure that Professor Plokhii could offer a completely alternative list to mine. But here's what I see as the 4 kind of key developments. Demographic losses. How many people died as a result of the Holodomor in Ukraine? Well, Jim Mace was amazingly cautious in his report in 1988. He said, I refuse to name a number. It could be anywhere between 3 million and 10 million, but it's impossible to arrive at a precise number. During the Yushchenko era, the number 10 million was thrown around. By official circles, it appears in official publications, but it's not clear to me whether that means 32, 33, or is that a reference to the Holodomors, the 3 Holodomors. Historians are now beginning, for maybe out of exhaustion, to settle on a range of about 2.5 to 3.9 million excessive deaths. There have been several teams of demographers that have gone at this question. I think virtually every demographer and historian who's considered this question has noted, as Norman Neymark did yesterday, that we can't really establish a precise figure because of the very serious problems of the 1937, 1939 data. It's just so unreliable. And one of the frustrating things, I think, for people who study the Holodomor is you can't disaggregate. We don't know how many women died versus how many men. How many were non-Ukrainians versus Ukrainians. I mean, the number of 3.5, 2.9 million excess deaths is just simply a big sort of ballpark figure. It should be noted, moreover, that it's an excess death, and it really doesn't begin to capture the whole extent of the demographic catastrophe. So the drop in birth rate, the fall in life expectancy, this demographic trough that was created because so many children died, lost births. Olga believes that that accounts for at least another million people in terms of lost births. I don't think anybody disagrees it's a demographic catastrophe. Secondly, methods. How is the Holodomor implemented? Well, we've learned a lot more about the specific measures and practices that were introduced in the Ukraine and in Kuban in 1932-33, the mechanism by which people were starved to death. So from the decree of the 20th of November 1932, which halted the payment of grain to collective farm workers who didn't meet their quota, to the forcible removal of food from houses, there were special punitive measures that were put in place. As one economic historian said, it was an act of commission, not an act of omission. In particular, though, I think we've learned a lot about the blacklisting of villages, the so-called Chorny Doshki. Serhii Plokhii is a senior researcher at the Institute of History at the Academy of Sciences, has been studying this subject for over a decade, and has compiled a list of 180-page long list of villages and collective farms that were blacklisted in the winter of 32-33, 180 pages. And what we've learned, of course, is that the practice of blacklisting villages, which much more extensive and discriminatory and lethal than anyone had previously known. What did it mean to blacklist a village? First of all the stores were closed, all trade was prohibited, including trade in food and grain. All the bank accounts, all the credits were called in. All the grain advances were taken out. Usually, almost invariably, the local collective farm chair and the local party members were purged, often subject to arrest. Food and livestock would be confiscated as a penalty, and then the territory would be sealed off by the OGPU, by the secret police. So people had their food taken away, and they weren't allowed to leave. In effect, it was a death sentence, as Professor Krzyzewski has said. The system of blacklisting was formalized by a decree which is called the Struggle Against Kurkul Influence in Collective Farms. As Plokhii has pointed out, however, the target of the blacklist were often entire villages, not just collective farms and not just kurkuls. There's no selection there. That is, all of the inhabitants of a village were branded as kurkuls and punished, even those who weren't directly involved in the production of grain. Popakhin's research also shed light on how authorities identified villages to be blacklisted. Villages with known supporters of the Ukrainian National Republic in 1919, or with a history of resistance to Bolshevik grain requisitioning during the Civil War or resistance to collectivization, were singled out. So, for example, the entire village of Mazurivka in Vinnytsia Oblast, for example, was blacklisted because it was the birthplace of one of Petliura's military commanders. The size of the village was very important as well. It had to be a village that was prominent in the rayon. And we know from the internal correspondence that it was intended to serve as a warning to the remainder of the population. That's why the names of the villages were and the collective farms were published. According to Plokhii, there were blacklisted villages in all of the oblasts of Ukraine, and in some districts, or rayon, virtually every settlement were included. There were 5 rayon in Vinnytsia that included every single settlement. In Dnipropetrovsk, which actually was much larger, even this is the 1934 administrative units, there was a blacklisted village in every single rayon. The other major revelation, I would argue, was the discovery of the existence of a formal decree prohibiting peasants in Ukraine and the Kuban from leaving starvation-hit areas in search of food and going to neighboring regions. It was a secret directive issued in Moscow on January 22nd, 1933, entitled "Preventing the Mass Exodus of Peasants Who Are Starving." In effect, the borders of Soviet Ukraine and the Kuban, not just the North Caucasus, but the Kuban, were closed by the secret police and militia detachments. Something like 200,000 people were arrested in the first 6 weeks trying to cross the border. We know now it was an order formally signed by Stalin himself. This is what Roman Serbin has called the smoking gun. He says this directive is perhaps, quote, the best available evidence, proof of the dictator's genocidal intent against the Ukrainian nation. Stalin. What have we learned about Stalin and his intentions? Well, the question of intentions has always been at the heart of the discussion of the Holodomor. Historians have always been keenly interested in this problem. What did the Kremlin know? When did they know it? How did they respond to the information they had? This research, the research done especially by Stanislav Kuchitsky and Valery Vasilyev and Mykola Doroshko, puts to rest once and for all any notion that Stalin and the Politburo might have been unaware of how serious the situation was in Ukraine in 1932 and 33. Mace believed that Stalin knew by December 1932, and he was basing this on anecdotal evidence. We now know Stalin knew all along. There are lots of documents from this period that make clear that, in fact, Ukraine was in crisis by early 1932. There was evidence of famine already then. People were starving to death. There were reports of cannibalism that surfaced in the spring of 1932. People were beginning to flee the village. Popular opposition was growing. Farmers were slaughtering their livestock. Armed grain collection brigades were roaming the countryside. Violence was mounting. The agricultural sector appeared to be collapsing at that point. There was unrest in the party, and in some areas, Soviet authority itself was breaking down. Collectivization, I think at this point, was nothing short of a disaster. Stalin, as we know, was very much a detail man, intimately involved in the smallest details of administration. I mean, he noted specific stanitsi in the Kuban that should be deported. He named them by name. He himself expressed concern on numerous occasions about what was going on in Ukraine. Famously in a letter to Kaganovich in August 32, the chief thing now is Ukraine. Things in Ukraine are terrible. If we don't make an effort now to improve the situation in Ukraine, we may lose Ukraine. And he said this a couple of times, or wrote this in his correspondence. Well, how did Stalin respond to this crisis? Well, he responded in a manner that we now know became typical for him. That is, he blamed the Ukrainians. He blamed, and he used the word Ukrainians when he was speaking of Ukrainian Communist Party leaders like Chubat and Kosyot. His solution was to intensify the use of force and repression. What this research, I think, has also revealed is the political dimension of Stalin's thinking and a special fixation he had on Ukraine at this time. That is, the campaign in 32, the campaign for grain in 32, 33, was not just about grain. It was part of a larger political battle for Ukraine, a fight against what he deemed counter-revolution. It became part of his own, I think, and here I disagree with Norman Neymark, it became part of a fight for his own survival. I really do believe collectivization was such a mess that there came a point where there was no possibility of admitting that. They had to go forward, and there were critics within the party. Ukrainian communists in particular weren't to be trusted. And in the fall of 1932, the Kremlin prepared for this kind of decisive battle, mobilizing the party, mobilizing military units, mobilizing the Secret Service for the campaign. In effect, it was a kind of counterinsurgency launched against an unarmed civilian population. he sent his most trusted lieutenants to oversee the operation, to purge the party of unreliable elements, and ultimately to deliver the crippling blow, sokrushitny udar, as Stalin put it. A point worth emphasizing here is, a point originally made by Jim Mace, was the way in which the policy of Ukrainianization came to be implicated in the terror famine. That is, for Stalin, and he wrote about this, there was a direct connection between peasant resistance to collectivization, the difficulties of grain procurement on the one hand, and the policy of Ukrainianization on the other. The two were linked. He called it the incorrect policy of Ukrainianization, which had given legal cover to all manner of bourgeois nationalists, Petlurites, Kurkuis, who were based in the countryside. He wasn't talking about the urban intelligentsia. He was talking about those elements, those Petluris who had infiltrated the collective farms. And what he was really talking about was accountants, members of village Soviets, administrators, warehouse supervisors. If you were a warehouse supervisor, you're almost certain to be arrested. He signed a decree in December 1932 ordering the arrests of these elements in the party and all Soviet institutions, and simultaneously he closed down all Ukrainian newspapers and journals and Ukrainian language education in the Kuban. It became a pretext for a massive purge of the Communist Party of Ukraine and farm administrators. Something like 50% of all collective farm chairs and their assistants were purged. Thousands of people were arrested. Something like 125,000 in 1933. Thousands were sent to concentration camps. Ukrainian intellectuals, hundreds of them at least, were expelled from their research institutes. And Pavel Postashev then later declared 1933 was the year of the defeat of the Ukrainian nationalist counter-revolution. Genocide. Was it genocide? That's my fourth point. Well, I'm not going to belabor this point because we had a long discussion about Raphael Lemkin yesterday. But I would argue that one of the developments that's exerted enormous influence on the study of the Holodomor has been the emergence of genocide studies in the late 1990s. Genocide studies as a distinct academic field, and in particular the rediscovery of Raphael Lemkin, the originator of the concept of genocide, the spirit behind the UN Convention. And this has excited a lot of scholars of the Holodomor because in his view, genocide was a complex process with many forms, including political, economic, and cultural coercion, not just physical violence. And he specifically wrote about genocide in Soviet Ukraine. Again, we covered this yesterday, so I really don't want to talk about this at any length. Of course, not all historians of Ukraine have been persuaded by the genocide argument, most notably Valery Soldatenko, the current director of the National Institute of National Memory, continues to reject the concept of genocide. For him, and again, he admits he's in a minority, he has some like-minded historians, but his argument is basically that there's not a single document that supports the concept of the Holodomor as genocide, or that even hints at ethnic motives, and that we have to understand what happened in Ukraine in a larger context, that is, the need to industrialize the threat of war, overcoming the resistance of the peasantry was necessary. The famine in his mind was not a uniquely Ukrainian experience, but, as he says, a common tragedy shared by all the people, echoing Yanukovych. What's interesting to my mind, and a measure, I think, of how far our understanding of the Holodomor has changed, is the very narrowness of the debate that Soldatenko describes. And he's described it as a debate. That is, even the opponents of genocide, of the concept of genocide, accept the basic outlines. There's no significant argument about the number of people who died. There is a general agreement that they died as a result of the policies that were implemented by the party leadership. We're no longer debating whether the famine was the result of natural causes. And it all seems to come down to the issue of intentions. But for Soldatenko, the debate is really about the significance of what happened. That is, for him, the Holodomor was a tragic price, a terribly steep and ultimately justifiable price that was paid for modernization. Curiously, what's largely been missing from the academic literature are Ukrainians themselves. That is, the millions of ordinary men and women who experienced and participated in collectivization, dekulakization, and the Holodomor. Now, this may seem like an outrageous statement in light of the really enormous efforts that have been made to collect and publish eyewitness testimonies, to collect the names of people who died, to remember them, to commemorate them. Yet we know relatively little about the lives of these people beyond their names. Among historians of Ukraine, much of the focus has been on what James C. Scott, the anthropologist, calls "seem like a state." That is, the work has emphasized the intentions, the policy, and methods of the leadership. The story's really been about Stalin and Molotov and Kaganovich and Kosyin and Chubar and what they thought, how they spoke. We even use their language, what they did. One of the consequences of the genocide debate is that it continues to marginalize in the academic literature the people who actually experienced the Holodomor. There are accounts of survivors, but they remain distant from the academic literature. And if they're summoned at all, they're summoned as witnesses to the deeds of others. So what we really lack is a kind of full-blooded, rich, detailed history from below. The two works that transformed my own understanding of the Holodomor, and here I'm speaking for myself, were Lynn Viola's Peasant Rebels Under Stalinist Collectivization and Andrei Graziosi's The Great Soviet Peasant War, both of which were published in 1996. Neither of these was, strictly speaking, about Ukrainian peasants, but they figured very prominently in both accounts. The very fact of resistance wasn't a great revelation, but it was the scale of the resistance to state policies in Ukraine, their duration, their intensity, that really took me, and I think a lot of my colleagues, by surprise. Ukraine, during collectivization, led the Soviet Union in revolt. The statistics of the secret police bear this out. In 1930, at the height of resistance, according to the OGPU sources, something like 1 million people in Ukraine participated in protests. Throughout Ukraine, as Viola describes, peasants rose up in defense of their property, their neighbors, and culture, displaying a sense of political and national outrage and purpose unparalleled in Soviet Ukraine. The real breakthrough, I would say, of these two books was in their approach, that is, in the way that they foregrounded previously marginalized actors. There were histories of ordinary people, how they thought, how they behaved, how they attempted to survive under extraordinary circumstances. It was a history that exposed the unevenness of Soviet power. So collectivization, as Viola explains it, wasn't just an economic policy, it was a clash of cultures, a wholesale assault on the cultural traditions and institutions of the village, most notably the church. That's how the peasants, she believed, understood it. That is, it was a struggle. It was a struggle for power and control. It was a struggle to subjugate them. And the Holodomor, I realized, taking Viola's argument to its logical conclusion, was really the climax of this kind of life and death struggle. Peasant Rebels and the Great Soviet Peasant War were my first real glimpse into the enormous possibilities of a decentered history of Soviet Ukraine. And there is evidence that historians in Ukraine are moving in this direction, that is, from an emphasis on high politics towards a more complex social history of the Holodomor. I'm not going to read you a list of the works that have been done. There are some important works. I can bring them up in the discussion if you like. What I'd like to do is get to the last question. What impact has the study of the Holodomor had on our understanding of Ukrainian history so far? Well, for Soldatenko and historians of Ukraine who share his views, the Holodomor, as I mentioned, was a terrible price that had to be paid for industrialization and modernization. For others, the Holodomor represents the darkest chapter in a whole series of violent assaults on the Ukrainian people perpetuated by a totalitarian state, hence the plural term Holodomors. For many, the significance is measured and continues to be measured in terms of the numbers of lives lost in the scale and size of the demographic catastrophe. Most of the discussion, however, it really remains enmeshed in a kind of discourse on communism, on the nature of communism and the Soviet Union. So as a way of opening up the discussion, allow me to tell you how the Holodomor has changed my own understanding of Ukrainian history. And again, I come to the subject from the 19th century, so I can't help but situate it in a larger context. And thinking about the Holodomor, I've been struck for some time by the enormity of the rupture that this period of collectivization and the killer famine represent. That is, in terms of patterns of migration, in terms of family structure, religious practices, rituals of courtship, rituals of marriage, naming practices, in terms of status and ranking, in terms of attitude towards power, towards authority, towards political participation, in terms of social identity. The era of the Holodomor, beginning in 28-29, is a radical break in Ukrainian history. Oops. It's the end of a social order, I would argue, the end of a set of social structures, social institutions, social practices that persisted with modifications, of course, since at least the 17th century. Maybe to put it a different way, the Holodomor is really the destruction of the seedbed of Ukrainian culture. It challenges the way we periodize Ukrainian history. 1917 is usually regarded as the turning point, the beginning of a new era. In a certain sense, it was. But I think there's a strong case to be made, a very strong case, that the Holodomor era is the true turning point. One of the two most important dates in early modern and modern history. That is the Khmelnytsky uprising in the 17th century. And of course, we can debate this, and the Holodomor. So in that respect, I would argue that we can't conflate the Holodomor with the other social catastrophes of the 20th century. However devastating they might have been, the Holodomor era is uniquely ruinous. Finally, one last point with your indulgence. I think the Holodomor has created a kind of great intellectual crisis for historians of Ukraine. After all, how do you study Ukrainian history if there are no longer any autonomous social groups that are identified with Ukrainian? For the great Ukrainian historian Mikhailo Hrushevsky, as for Volodymyr Antonovich and Mykola Kostomarov before them, the Ukrainian people were the subject of history. Ukrainian history was social history. It was the history of Cossacks, it was the history of Ukrainian burghers, it was the history of the clergy, it was the history of the Cossack gentry, it was the history of the peasantry. With collectivization in the Holodomor, the very subject of Ukrainian history disappears, in a sense. Hrushevsky, I think it's no coincidence, is himself arrested at this time in March 1931, and then dies in exile in 1934. And I'm going to throw out a very provocative idea at the end. I think postmodernist historians have it wrong. Ukrainians weren't invented in the 20th century. They were actually de-invented. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Andriewsky. Let us ask our discussant, Professor Plokhii, for his remarks.
Ukrainian history, and again, here with I'm in the same situation as Olga was trying to figure out what exactly that means, and I defined us in a little bit different way. So historians of Ukraine or of Eastern Europe who come to the field of Holodomor and Holodomor studies from different periods and different eras. And what can we learn for our periods, for our subjects, for our topics, but by looking at the enormous literature that was produced in the last 20-25 years. And Olga read her paper without footnotes, which makes a lot of sense. But footnotes is a big part of this paper, and also for me it was really very impressive when I looked on literature in a number of languages, focused on the famine, focused on the issues of collectivization. And that made me, I should admit, I had mixed feelings. On the one hand, I was really very happy for the field and people who work in the field, but I was always also quite jealous in the sense of, as someone coming from the 17th century and doing research on other subjects of history. So there is a lot that we can learn from recent advances in the study of the Holodomor or Great Famine of 1932-1933. It certainly impacted in a major way the way how history is studied, the history is researched in Ukraine, for example. Well, it is because of the study of Holodomor that the entire field of oral history came out of nowhere in the late 1980s and then in the 1990s. And again, that was the beginning. Then we had the project on the oral history of the Greek Catholic Church. And oral history is now part of the landscape, Ukrainian historiographic landscape when it comes to methods of history. I decided to look at the impact or potential impact of Holodomor studies on other areas and periods of Ukrainian history by looking at social, political, national, international, and ecological aspects of the history of Ukraine. And I would like to start here exactly where Olga ended, and this is with the Holodomor being basically part of this major change in Ukrainian history, early modern and modern history, the change of the order, something that in the Russian historiography is referred to as раскрестьянивание. We talked a little bit about the end of peasantry as a social group, or dekozakization that is happening in Kuban. And from that point of view, it's important to put famine, not to look at famine in isolation, but put it into the context of what is happening at that time in Ukraine. Because famine as such is not a unique part of Ukrainian early modern and modern history. There are famines before 20th century. There are 3 famines in the 20th century. So the famine, when people go to the survivors and talk about that, they don't have, of course, term Holodomor. They talk about Holodovka, Holodivka, and they would talk about 1921-22, 1932-33, and then 47 as well. And for them, it's really sometimes very difficult to figure out how different potentially one was from another, in the sense that if the half of the village dies and it doesn't cover the entire Ukraine, well, it's still the same kind of a tragedy for people who live in this village. What makes certainly the famine of 1932-1933 unique, apart from its scope, is also the role of the government, the role of the state played in it. It's one thing. And another, from the perspective of Ukrainian history, early modern and modern, Holodomor is a key figure in the process of collectivization. Again, when you ask survivors and you ask questions that are not focused just on the famine, the life would not be divided, life before famine and after famine. The life would be divided before collective farms and after collective farms. And again, collectivization probably would not happen in Ukraine, at least at that time and in that forms, if there would be no famine. And this is important This is really something really very important that has of course, then impact on the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and Ukrainian history and till 91 and what is happening in Ukraine today. So that's my take on the social part of that, political part of that. We have been talking a lot about Stalin's desire to break the back of Ukrainian nation, of peasants, Ukrainian peasants. And there are good reasons to talk about that. Bogdan Klit yesterday said that the Soviet Union was probably not only affirmative action empire, but also was a politically empire of political correctness. And certain things you wouldn't just say, even in correspondence with your closest associates. But I have also a feeling that quite often we try to read between the lines in Stalin's work and refuse to see what is actually in the lines. And when you look at the lines, when you look at what he writes to Gaganovich, and he writes about the Ukrainian leadership and Ukrainian Communist Party, rayon. So this, the officials in the rayons are his main enemy, and he writes that Kasior is too soft on that. So for me, this is the story of Holodomor is also a story of actually resistance to the power coming from the center of this new indigenous elite that came to the existence in the years of Ukrainization in the 1920s. Because if you look at the GPU arrest lists from 1932 and 1933, who is there? Of course, the kulaks and peasantry are deported. But who is there? There are the representatives of the local elite, party, Soviet elite, and so on and so forth. So the war and the struggle that Stalin wages is also for the control of the party and the control of this new crop of indigenous elite that grew up in the 1920s. And this is an important part of the story of relationship between that elite and Moscow through the entire history of Ukraine in the 20th century. If you try just to read between the lines and look for the nation and forget about what is in the lines and what is there, it would be impossible to understand the Ukrainian independence of 1991. It would be impossible to understand where Kravchuk comes from and where the alliance with National Democrats are coming from. And the history of the famine and what we see there is also the struggle and battle to a degree between Moscow and Kharkiv, between the center and the new elite that came to existence after 1917, and for the first time in Ukrainian history has a very strong affiliation and identity, Ukraine as an elite, Ukrainian identity and connection to people. National factor. What Holodomor reminds me about is that, and that was traditionally overlooked in takes on Soviet history and Ukrainian history as part of Soviet history, is that the national factor is always or almost always there when it comes to the politics between the center and Ukraine. What I would like to say at the same time is that it's not always national factor. And the national factor is maybe there, but it not always is the defining factor. And in the case of Holodomor, we have national and social factors coming together, Ukrainian and peasant. And we talked about that yesterday, and this is something that one has to keep in mind, first of all, of presence of national factor, but also that its relation to other factors in defining of Ukrainian history in the 20th century can be very different. International. Works by Timothy Snyder, Hiroaki Kuromiya, basically helped us to understand that famine happened also in a very specific and particular context, not only in terms of the Stalin's policy within the Soviet Union, but also in terms of the policy international. It mattered what the relations were between Moscow and Japan. It mattered what the relations were between Moscow and Warsaw, and timing from that point of view was very important. Stalin's attempt to break the back of the party elites, Ukrainian party elites who are allegedly conscious or unconscious petrol riots, is linked, of course, to his idea to turn Ukraine into a fortress, into a socialist fortress. So the borderland position and the borderland situation of Ukraine is always an important factor in Moscow's thinking about Ukraine, but also in defining the nature of processes that take place there. It is extremely important during the interwar period when Ukraine is on the border. It is important in World War II. It is important element, extremely important element in the liquidation of the Greek Catholic Church in the 1946 and then late 40s and early 50s. It kind of recedes into the background once you get Poland and Romania and Czechoslovakia in the Soviet embrace. But for the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the fact of the big and very politically active immigration, in particular in the United States and Canada, becomes again a factor that in many ways influences the thinking of Moscow, but also what Kiev doing in 50s, 60s, and 70s in terms of its own policy on nationality, on history, and other things. These people are there. So the assassination of Bandera from that point of view is not only the fact that, okay, Khrushchev was unhappy with his memories about late 40s. This is actually the Kremlin's way to deal with this external threat that in Kremlin's mind were coming from the immigration. And last but not least, the ecological question. Later today in the evening, we'll have an opportunity and privilege to show you a little bit of the maps of Ukrainian famine, GIS map project. And we'll be happy to answer your questions. In terms of some kind of a preview, I want to say that one of many discoveries that we made after we tried to put the data on Ukrainian famine on the map was that for some reason more people were dying in one ecological zone of Ukraine than in the other. And for some reasons which we attribute to the actions of the government, it wasn't the south, the areas that were most prone to droughts and other things. And we can talk about that later. I don't have much time, but from that point of view, this quite recent discoveries in the history of the famine reminded me about the importance of ecological factor in Ukrainian history in general. I knew about that as a historian of early modern history and historian of Kazakhstan in particular, the phenomenon, the social phenomenon that comes on this borderland between different ecological zones, the boreal steppe zone and the steppe zone. But it looks like it continues its importance all the way into the 20th century. And for the nation that went through the terrible, the worst nuclear disaster in the world history of Chernobyl, we had great beginning with David Marples' work on Chernobyl, but then there is very little done in terms of the ecological history of Ukraine, defined in any way, and ecology was an important part of a famine, as one would expect. But in the case of famine of 1932-33, it was the government intervention actually made to work it differently. Now, in conclusion, I'll go back to where I started, and this my sense of envy to a degree and jealousy toward the colleagues and friends who are working in such vibrant field and make such wonderful discoveries. Well, as one would expect from a jealous man, I'm not completely happy about it. And there are pluses and minuses that come with that. Today, when I try, during first meeting of the class on Ukrainian history of Harvard, I try to figure out what brought people to the class and try to ask them whether they know anything about Ukrainian history. It would be the famine of 1932, 1933, the Holodomor that they would know. Great success, certainly, in the context of this conference and the efforts that the institutions and sometimes government put into that in Ukraine, and the effort that the Ukrainian diaspora undertakes here. But it also reminds me about the introduction to Anna Reid's book, Bottle and the Journey Through Ukrainian History, who writes that her boyfriend, going through her files when she was working on the Ukrainian history, noticed the files, war, famine, Holocaust, another famine, and said, okay, did these people ever had anything but disasters in their life? Well, during the revolution, of course, Vinnychenko was writing that it is impossible to read Ukrainian history without bromide. And basically, I would like to finish my comments and remarks with call for contextualizing the history of famine and in more than one way. And to use still we have a lot of gaps and a lot of research is needed on the work of Holodomor, but still use to achievements that are there in terms of our understanding of the processes, long-term processes in Ukrainian history. To introduce the academic community and the world in general also to aspects of Ukrainian cultural history, to the interesting aspects of Ukrainian social history, international, military, and otherwise. So I'm calling on you to build on this success in more than one way. And at that, I would like to thank the organizers, and I would like to thank presenters. Thank you very much.
Procedure that they had established before the conference and would hope that...
Why was this procedure established?
Because the organizers decided. Very simple.
Maybe it is to shield the speakers.
Oh, no one would never want to shield any speakers nor silence anyone.
Speaker and contra speaker. What about the contra speaker?
What is the procedure?
And the procedure is the following. The first is to allow all of the people who are actively present in the program, and within that context to begin with the youngest scholars, and then other participants in the program, and then as well anyone else in the audience. So with that, and I see a young person right here, please.
My name is Katerina Bondar. I'm an LLM graduate from Harvard and a PhD candidate in Kyiv. Thank you very much for your presentations. My question is like a comment and question. Today, more Western scholars study or take account of the Holodomor. For example, French scholar Philippe Delara recently expressed his opinion that Ukrainians should do everything possible to get international recognition of the Holodomor as a genocide. On the point of recognition and finding of the Ukrainian famine, you mentioned about political dimension and different steps taken by the Ukrainian during the era of different Ukrainian presidents. Can you elaborate more on what you think about this process, whether what was done was enough or, the flaws of the process? I mean, I'm interested in that particularly, both domestic and on the international arena. Also, you do not speak about, for example, decision of the Kyiv Court of Appeals and commission set up by Yushchenko. And also there was an international commission in the US as well, like a second type of process. So basically, I'm interested in the importance of all of those steps as well, and maybe more generally, what is needed in terms of recognition from your point of view, and whether any international responsibility is really needed or not. Maybe maybe a truth commission should have been established at some point, particularly at the point when state archives were opened. And I think that there was no such truth commission ever established, because a commission by the president was a different type of organization. And basically, the second question is, it seems to me that there is a trend now in Ukraine to speak about holods, like famines in the 20th century, not really separately about, but in this particular point of time. Maybe it's also explained by some government policy. So what do you think, whether it's, I'm interested whether you think it's right, conceptually right, and about terminology like holod, famine, genocide, and Holodomor, whether it's right policy to speak about different famines in Ukraine's 20th century. Thank you.
My name is Markian Dubchansky. I'm from Stanford. I'd like to ask, we focus a lot, for obvious reasons, on the rural dimension of the Holodomor, and I wanted to ask if you had any thoughts or wanted to talk a little bit about the role of cities in Ukrainian history, and specifically, and for example, do city dwellers experience the Holodomor in the same way? Do migrants with memories of the Holodomor tend to go to the cities, or do they stay in the villages? What role do cities play in this context?
Hello, my name is Ali Kinsella, and I'm from Colombia. You spoke rather positively about the steps taken under Yushchenko to commemorate or return the Holodomor to public memory. Do you think it's possible to commemorate the Holodomor in the wrong way? And what would the consequences of this be?
Your name is Katerina? Yes, Katerina. I think that they should put you in charge of figuring out what Ukraine needs to do. You've obviously thought about this much more than I have. I don't mean to be flippant, but I was interested in the problem of commemoration as it related to research and education. And for me, the really significant thing is if 60% of the population of Ukraine now thinks that the Holodomor is genocide, I mean, that's an accomplishment of the Yushchenko presidency. I mean, I can't imagine where that number would be without it. As to the specific kinds of things that could be done, like truth commissions, tribunals. I know that, I mean, there's a whole legal process to this. The SBU investigated the number of people who died, and they came up with the number actually they came up with the number of 10 million, which gets me to the third question: is there a wrong way to do it? Yes, I think there's a wrong way to do it, and that is to put pressure on what the conclusions of research have to be. And the state is has been so part of this project, at least it was under Yushchenko, that I wonder, I don't know, I haven't talked to Dr. Kulchitsky and others, did they ever feel pressure to come to certain conclusions that they might not have been comfortable coming to? So in terms of research, I think that's a very clear, that's where my interest lies, and I think that would be terrible. That would be terrible. Or to narrow the research to really dictate what the conclusions have to be. Regarding the role of cities, yes. I mean, Hiroaki Kuromiya's book on Donetsk is wonderful in describing the impact that the famine had in a place like Donetsk. I mean, people fleeing to cities, but cities also going hungry. I mean, part of the problem is just being able to feed the urban population, feed the industrial workers. And the cities suffered greatly as well. And I think actually the point about memory is a fantastic one. I think the site of memory is the village. That once people move once people flee in order to get away and become part of this kind of anonymous urban culture, that memory is lost, that if there's any place, I mean, I don't think it's a mistake that when the memorials started to go up, they went up in villages and they went up in the countryside, and then they were put up in Kyiv. Just to throw this out, I mean, this has fascinated me. about memorials. I saw a transcript of a television program that took place about 3 years ago. Actually, it was on the anniversary, the 75th anniversary, in which Russian commentators and Russian historians, including the very famous Russian historian Ivnitsky, were talking about this. And I think it was Ivnitsky who mentioned there's one memorial to victims of the famine in Penza, in all of Russia. It's been 4 years, maybe something else has been put up. But to me, that contrast is very dramatic, the way Ukrainians almost immediately began to create sites of memory, whereas, in other places that also suffered from a devastating famine, there wasn't that same urge. I'm sure somebody will come up with a good explanation for that.
Yeah, I feel most qualified to a degree to talk about the question dealing with the cities, and my qualification comes from two sources. One of them is it is working. One of them is that I wouldn't be here, or I wouldn't exist at all if part of my family wouldn't leave the village and come to Zaporizhia in southern Ukraine, and that's how they survived. That's how they survived famine. So there was starvation, there were other things, but that was also a chance for survival. And another source of my qualification again deals with the GIS map project and the research of demographers, and in particular Oleg Volovina, who was already mentioned here, Natalia Levchuk, and a number of people working with them in Kyiv shows that while there is, in terms of the excessive death, there are minimal changes with the urban population. There is a huge spike in 1932, 1933 in terms of the villages, and also small towns. So when we talk about the cities, one should make a distinction between major industrial centers like Kharkiv, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, so the construction sites of socialism and communism, which were centrally supplied, and the smaller towns in central, mostly Ukraine, that were left actually on their own. There was no centralized supplies. In the big cities, and they're struggling now with this data and checking and rechecking it, but what the demographers are finding that the death rate or excessive death rate was extremely high in the suburbs of the big cities. And again, there is a question of, they're now redoing their calculations to be sure that this is exactly what they're getting, but also there can be a number of explanations, and again, all of them deal with the government policy of why that could be the case. So thanks for your question.
There's three more questions right here. First, this lady from Kazakhstan, I believe. Please, why don't you, and then the young gentleman and Professor Graziosi.
Okay, so my name is Diana, and I'm from Cambridge University and also from Kazakhstan. Thank you very much for both of the presentation. I really liked it, and I really liked the approach. And I was interested that what kind of, you talked about, the speaker, you talked about the nation, and I really loved the concluding remark that the Ukrainian nation wasn't invented, it was de-invented during that time. But what impact did Holodomor have on that sense of nation, not constructed under Yushchenko, like, a particular nation building narratives of remembering stuff, but actually during, like right after Holodomor and during the Soviet Union, when people who are coming from basically from the masses from below, how did people like construct the sense of belonging to a particular nation that was de-invented during that time? And how did they put up with this constant sense of censorship that you couldn't talk about your tragedy, you couldn't talk about what happened in your family, you couldn't commemorate them, right? And we were talking about that yesterday. And what I'm interested in the memorials, because I was really fascinated by the Kyiv Memorial Museum that was put up. And I was interested that you were talking about when the memorials started coming up in 1980s in the villages. Was there a particular like shared narrative of putting a particular symbol in that memorials? And was it like, some kind of a sense of this memory coming back in terms of the symbolism of the memorials coming up in different villages, not really particularly connected by a particular political project of, processing the specific symbolism, but actually coming out from the masses. Thank you.
So I'm Joseph Livesey. I'm a PhD candidate in anthropology at New York University. And I wanted to just ask about or raise the sort of point of the impact of Holodomor studies on Ukrainian society. And one thing I would point out is the disinterest among young people in Ukraine in this topic. When I was doing research in archives in Kiev in summer of 2010, and I would tell young successful friends of mine what I was doing, they would be like, why do you want to keep sort of doing this? What's the, this is a boring, over-egged topic now, okay, which I don't agree with. But it's a fact. And so when we're talking about the Institute of, I'm interested in the role of the state in historical knowledge production. And we talked about Dr. Andriewsky talked about the Institute of National Memory. And when the changes were made after Yanukovych became president, there was this huge debate about, and there was a lot of, in Ukrainska Pravda, there's a big discussion, and there was a lot of commentary on those articles. And really that debate for me came down to a debate about what the role of the state should be and what kind of historical knowledge it should be encouraging. And so what Soldatenko was saying, and I think we should take it seriously at least, is that these narratives should be ones that unite a whole Ukraine, i.e. not narratives about World War II, Holodomor, and the independence movement in the second half of the 20th century. And I have the privilege to withhold judgment about that, which is very nice for me. But again, so these are all ideas about the specific role of the state in production of historical knowledge. And it's hard for me to think that one should blame people who share Ukrainians who share Soldatenko's opinion, okay? Because often this relates to family members who live in other parts of the former Soviet Union, and these are understandable reasons to have want to create a space between yourself and this very highly contentious history. And so my question is kind of, what should the role of state institutions be here? Thank you.
Yes, I will offer some very brief comment and a slightly longer one. The first is about what Serhii was very rightly saying about the geographical distribution of mortality, which is extremely interesting. And I just mentioned this because it opens new perspective and people asked yesterday about it. Small towns, of course, in that region means shtetl. And shtetl had been already very badly hit by the end of the NEP, because many of the artisans, the shopkeepers, the small industrialists, and by the hunt for, the fight against the church, then the synagogue, the religious Jews. So this is just to say that the famine, of course, was intended to eat the Ukrainian. This is very true, I think. But Mennonites could be another example. There is a national dimension that is not all Ukrainian. This is just a comment. This is should be studied. The second point, I totally agree with Olga. The new frontier, it's not new because everybody was doing, is this history, how peasants went through this. This is going to be very tough. I don't know if I envy the people who are going to study this, but for example, because cannibalism is, I tried to say this, it's a great topic in itself, and how did the peasant experience this? And so I think this is very right, and we are waiting for it. But maybe it's normal that first you reconstruct the general political, geographical picture, and then this is only normal in history. It's always been this way. First you do the political history, and then the other comes. So another very short comment is about, I like the joke, the Ukraine has been de-invented, that Olga did at the end of her talk. And of course, I'm not a postmodern historian at all, having my age, but they could answer you that, of course, you are just proving the plasticity of nations. Because you can either invent or they invent them. The problem, there are boundaries to this, so postmodernists, I think, are wrong. But it's true that they were openly speaking of changing the ethnographic material in 1932-33. This is you find in the sources. So, and I just will remember the quote, I think was Bogdan Klit, of or maybe it was Roman Serbin actually, of Lemkin, when Lemkin said what is a nationality. Those points were shared by common culture that included Stalin, and these elements you could play with. You could make out of a South Slav, a Macedonian, a Bulgarian, a Serbian. So there was a plasticity also into non-making, in unmaking. So this is a very good point and deserves our attention. That's slightly longer. It's not because I've been obsessed by it, but because this is why I am interested in it. Is when she said that Soldatyenko, whom I remember reading his History of the Civil War, said that the Holodomor is the terrible price that it has been paid for modernization, industrialization. Of course, this is precisely the problem with modernization, because this is not true. To modernize, you don't need to collectivize. Generally, to modernize, you need to give incentives to peasants, to let them move to cities, and so on and so forth. The problem is precisely they were not modernizing. They did the collectivization because they were building socialism. And to project the modernization in those theory to those years, I'm insisting, it's really betraying also Stalin in a way, and these motives, or the Bolsheviks. That is, I think we have to respect historical actors, to be philologists. They were not modernizing, otherwise there is no need for a collectivization. And if you collectivize, you are not building modernity, you are building a very specific system which has its own inbuilt features that are not relevant for the later developments. So I think this is Soldatyenko ideology of modernization is precisely why with Russian, because I have this problem with Russian scholars all the time. I tell them, look, it's not modernization. Otherwise, Ekaterinburg now would still be called the way it was called under the Soviet time. We would not be here. So, thank you.
Yes, I'm Mark van Hagen, Arizona State University. Okay. All right. Arizona State University, Mark van Hagen. Okay. I'd like to pick up on something that Serhii ended his remarks with, but also something that we haven't talked about, which is a contribution that our Vilmi chair today sent us yesterday about normalization of Ukrainian history. Maybe I can call it that. Is there, I mean, and at Columbia, my closest colleague was our Jewish historian, a Russian East European Jewish historian, and I kind of got this idea that Jewish historians have been through this kind of lachrymose phase of focusing on the Holocaust okay, just take it off, okay. Focusing on the Holocaust to the omission of everything else in Jewish history for a few thousand years, and is there some future that we can imagine for Ukraine's history that puts the Holodomor in some other context? And since this is all about contextualizing Holodomor, I think this is a question we can ask our friend Magocsi too to comment on this. But that's one piece of that, of the sort of where do we see the Holodomor in the future in a more holistic version of Ukraine's history. And I want to get back to the oral history question. And I know some of you, I've been telling you what besides when I do Ukrainian history, I have other interests in life. And lately I've been interviewing American veteran students, veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and doing oral history, and I've become kind of obsessed with oral history, and also with the positivist fetishism of most of our profession. Again, especially for for Serhii, he can't do oral history for early modern period, but for those of us who are in a more contemporary history, and that includes the Holodomor, given all the work that's been done on testimonies, historians, I think, have marginalized this issue partly because we've only had oral sources, as if that's a bad thing. And we thought that once we get NKVD sources and all those sort of positivistic official documents, we're going to learn the truth. Well, I have come to distance myself from that view, and I think part of what historians can do and should do, besides establishing what happened, is how people experienced what happened, how they processed what happened, and what that meant. And again, we have to think about the Holodomor through the context of World War II, through Chernobyl, and again, I would say through the Soviet-Afghan War, which is also a very traumatic experience, the last war that was fought in which Ukrainians contributed heavily to that conflict. And I'd like to make an appeal that we challenge the historical profession to take more seriously oral sources. Again, if you think, what are police sources that we prize so esteemed in such esteemed fashion? They are based on stories that were told under various conditions to NKVD officers. They might have recorded them accurately, but they might not have, and they certainly introduced some kind of biases because they had an agenda. Why is that source more reliable to tell the story of the Holodomor than the testimonies that have been collected for 40 years, 50 years now? So I think we need to kind of challenge history as a profession if we're going to get something about what this event means for Ukraine's history, for history in general. And I'll stop with that. Thank you.
I absolutely agree. I mean, it was my point in sort of building my presentation around Jim Mace's work, because he was working with interviews of survivors, and he was working with the Soviet press. But a lot of the things that a lot of the conclusions he came to were based on interviews. And an interview, I think, how many people did he interview? 150 people. It is remarkable. I mean, if you look at his conclusions, it's remarkable. He's a much more careful scholar than we've ever given him credit for. But it's remarkable how many things come out of the testimonies that then are confirmed in the documents. So, for example, I grew up among Holodomor survivors, and the story about the borders being closed, people talked about that. I actually didn't believe them. And that's why, you know, this decree came as such a shock to me, that they were right. They were absolutely right. I mean, so I take your point there. Social history, because that's been brought up. I don't think we've even begun to think about what the Holodomor really was. We talk about victims. We sort of mention perpetrators as though the lines are very clear. One of the things Irish historians discovered is there's almost no oral tradition around the famine in Ireland. And the Irish are so loquacious. They're good storytellers. And why are there no stories? And one of the conclusions that they've come to, and I think this is true of Ukrainians and other people who have suffered through something like this, what happens when you live through a famine? People make choices. A lot of the memories or the testimonies we have are from people who were kids, who were children at the time. That's one of the problems of collecting oral testimonies in the 1990s. We're really talking to a particular generation that wasn't in a position to say no to the brother who comes and begs for food. One of the horrors of famine is the way in which almost everybody is implicated. And that line between victims suddenly starts to get a lot more unclear. I think, going to Joseph's question, I think there's a big difference between academic history and social memory. And it does worry me the involvement of the state. I mean, will historians, and I include myself, will we have the courage to really write about the famine in a way that deconstructs this very need, you know, it happened to us, we were victims. Sense of nation construction, I haven't done research on this. I think their sense of self changed dramatically, profoundly as a result of, and again, I'm really talking of the period from 29 to 33. On the one hand, the state continued to stamp Ukrainian on their passports, so there was some kind of identity. But what did it mean in practice? What does it mean when you destroy the social and cultural practices that constitute being Ukrainian? So I have no, I will tell you, and I, as a historian, I try actually not to get into my personal life, but I did grow up among Holodomor survivors. And most of them didn't want to talk about it. Most of them really just wanted to live under the radar. And in 1983, as the 50th anniversary approached, there were some brave souls who said, no, you have to talk about it. You have to talk about what happened. And they didn't want to. They really didn't want to. I don't know what happened to their sense of self as a result. It was something catastrophic. Now, the Soviet experience is different. What happens if you don't leave the Soviet Union? What happens if you stay there? What in the long run happens there? And I'm sure, I know that Serhii is much more qualified to talk about that than I am.
I'll share a little bit of my stories. Yeah, there is no tendency to tell to a young child these stories, because this child then goes outside and then talks to the neighbors, and that can mean only trouble. So, but there are signs here and there, like in the middle of the family party, there would be a toast to one of the people who saved all of us, one of the members of my family. I didn't know what that meant. That was my grandma. I loved her. I thought everyone loved her. So for me, that was the most natural thing to happen. But let me start maybe with the first question and about the role of the state. And Joseph asked it. I don't think I actually will answer it completely, but I'll try to provide at least some context to what you are talking about. First thing is about study of famine not being really cool among the younger generation. Well, my feeling in general is that the state and state institutions are basically distrusted by the majority of the population in Ukraine. And there are good reasons that are on the surface in terms of what is happening in Ukraine, corruption and other things. But there is also, it seems to me, a deeper historical roots when this is for the first time in I don't know how many years that the Ukrainians are living in the state of their own. So the state is always foreign. And that doesn't change within one generation. So that can be one reason for that. Another reason is, of course, that when the promotion of Holodomor studies become the top of the agenda of the president who fails almost everywhere else, and basically whatever he touches gets basically the sign of this failure and almost automatic rejection. Louder. Okay. That's probably I'm still not comfortable talking loud about famine. Maybe that's. So the question about the Institute of National Memory. Here I would like to put Ukraine into the context. The model itself is imported, of course, from Eastern Europe. It is imported from Poland, but it is also a common feature for post-communist and post-socialist countries. And when you look at to the north and to the east, what is happening in Russia, the administration, the president and presidential administration is directly involved in like it was with Stalin in the 1930s of drafting or approving or not approving textbooks. So this is the context in which that institute comes to existence. And for me, the most interesting thing was that the institute that was abolished, and I learned that from Olga's presentation, by the presidential decree was recreated on the same day by the same presidential decree. So there was maybe a rejection of a certain line taken by the institute and people who were there, but there was no rejection of the idea that, okay, the state has a stake and has to be active player in creating or managing the realm of historical memory. Regarding shtetl and ethnicity versus nationality, again, more than once we were talking about Ukraine, saying Ukrainians this, Ukrainians that. Who are those Ukrainians? Well, Kosior is not an ethnic Ukraine. There are Chubar and Petrovsky, who is somewhere on the border, not really sure who he was, and there is Hatayevich, second secretary, who is a Jew. So once there was a question about what is the wrong way to think about the famine and commemorate it. It's basically to replace nation and nationality with ethnicity, because then we certainly get a very distorted picture. Normalization of Ukrainian history and the role of Holodomor, it's a great question, and agenda for thinking and agenda for research. Again, it is part of a major change. I here completely agree with Olga in the social order, and it should get that kind of attention. Not the sole attention, but as important, or maybe most important part, but in a bigger process, in a bigger shift. And oral sources, yes, absolutely, we have to do that. Of course, what goes for the police records is that allegedly, if they catch the guy in time, this is relatively close to the event that happened. Whatever literature I read about the way how we remember things, one of the arguments that is made that we don't remember really things the way how they happened. We remember how, for the first time, we verbalized that, and we verbalized that experience, and of course, stories change as time passes by. But this oral turn in the Holodomor studies, I hope, will lead the oral turn also in study of history of Ukraine in Ukraine and to a degree outside of Ukraine. And here we can join our forces with people in anthropology and learn from them. Thank you.
I'd just like to add one more thing, and that is, I feel like I'm in the movie The Bridesmaids. Oh, now I've lost my train of thought.
Or a good joke.
Yeah, it was a good joke, and I paid for it with loss of memory. I know what I was going to say. I think that Lynn Viola has shown how you can do her book on the kulaks, the unknown gulag, is a real masterpiece of working with personal narratives from the time. I mean, she found boxes and boxes of letters written by people who had been sent north, arrested as kulaks and sent north, and it's a valuable source. It's not just the interviews that were done in 1989. There are lots of other sources. The Harvard project on the Soviet social system has never been fully exploited, and it's got problems of its own, but it's an interesting source.
So I'd like to turn to the periodization issue. That is periodization of Ukrainian history as opposed to Russian imperial and Soviet history. When I began graduate school, Soviet history did not exist, right? You went to 1917, and at that point, Richard Pipes finished, and the political scientists took over. So there was no history of the Soviet Union. The whole field of Soviet history was created from the 1960s, at least at Harvard, maybe earlier in some other places on, and then slowly became an extremely important field in historical studies. Till by the point of the 1980s and 90s, it was quickly crowding out Russian imperial in all the historical fields I had known before. But what you got if you did Ukrainian history was clearly imprinted in you 1917, 1918 for both parts of Ukraine. That's before, after, all changes occur through that period. One, the revolution, the Russian Empire, and then, of course, we're coming near to the 1st of November 1918, the raising of the Ukrainian flag over the city hall in Lviv, Western Ukrainian history, end of Austria, beginning of a new zone. I then taught Professor Andriewsky, right? In my mind, although I'm talking about the famine in Ukraine and the Holodomor and all of these cataclysmic events, it would have never occurred to me to break down that periodization. Too deeply, that was the political, and what we have now, I think, with this discussion is to say, well, let's look, if we are going to look at various kinds of history, particularly social, cultural history, nation development, should we not throw out that periodization that we had and think about it in new ways? And I would argue that although this can affect our general discussion of the whole zone and region, including Russian empires, Austrian, and others, there is a specific Ukrainian dimension to it, which I think is of tremendous importance. And I think that was illustrated to me when our colleagues began to first arrive from the former Soviet Union by the late 1880s and 90s, and they described their experience from Eastern Ukraine, in pre-1939 Soviet Ukraine, and it did not match what I knew from the emigres who had come from that area after World War II in the 1950s. That is their reality to even question, did Ukrainians in Dnipropetrovsk region ever really celebrate Christmas Eve at meatless dinners? Had Pisanka ever existed in Kharkiv region? Now, I could prove from books that all these ethnographers would have told that in 1910 or 1915 they did. But of course, much more important was I knew those Eastern Ukrainians. True, changed by their emigration, changed by the experience outside of Ukraine, but they produced an invaluable source for checking things. I was struck with this, not on our period, but with Karl Berkhoff's book, which I think one of its weakest points is that he affirms oral testimony when it comes from within Ukraine and largely dismisses it when it comes from those groups come out. And I think you've got to put the two together to really piece together, to try and get back to it. But for all of, and I think, we can talk to a certain fatigue with Holodomor, particularly in Ukraine, but not only all. Many colleagues come to me and say, well, can't you come up with another topic in Ukrainian history? But what I fear is it's still not fully integrated into our understanding, and this issue of what it means for Ukrainian history. And I chose periodization. Periodization is often where we go for as a banal topic, but it means a lot of other things of trying to understand some sort of longue durée.
Yesterday, when I asked Professor Magocsi, the name is Magocsi, if he's coming to my lecture, he said no, so immediately I figured, well, he's got something against me, I don't know what. But then he gave me a text, and I looked at the text, and he says, you read this and you'll understand. And I read the text, and it says, choosing life over death on remembering Ukrainian genocide famine. It's very short, and I looked through it, and where he says that we have to introduce positive history into our historical discourse. And this idea was picked up by Professor Plokhii and then repeated by Professor von Hagen, and I realized great minds think alike. So if you don't mind, can I join your club? I would like to, I would really like to support this idea. I think it's fantastic, I think it's very important, and it's timely. There's only one however. The however is, first we have to settle what was the Holodomor. We have to settle that the Holodomor was a genocide and not just famine. This is the most important thing. Otherwise, if we introduce Holodomor into the general discourse of Ukrainian history with the positive, we will be missing the boat, we will be going backwards in our conceptualization of Ukrainian history. This is very important. Unfortunately, Professor Plokhii's commentary was very interesting. I have a lot of points that I made here noted down, but it was again fixated on the famine. We cannot do that. We have to open it to Holodomor as genocide. Unfortunately, I only have 20 minutes to speak later on, so I'm using the time here. When you get old, you become a little bit political as well. Now, just one or 2 points concerning the papers, or the paper and the commentary. Oops, I got my eyes back. Yeah. Right. Yes, I think we're beyond the point of trying to show that Stalin knew. We're beyond that point. That has been proven. I think that was evident from the documentation that was published in Ukraine and Soviet Ukraine 34 and so on by the speakers, which I will show this afternoon. But the point now is that he was responsible. He was behind it. He was the thinker. He was the one that started. That is the most important thing. So that would be, and a couple other things that I would mention. Now, Professor Plokhii's commentary, just one short point. If I understood you correctly, you said collectivization would not have happened without the famine. If I understood that correctly, that would mean first you'd have to have the famine and then the collectivization. Well, it's an interesting thought. It would have to be developed and shown, because by the time the famine of 32, you know, the big famine came around, most of the Ukrainian farmers were already collectivized. So are you suggesting that they would forcibly decollectivize themselves, or what? You know, and there are a couple of other points, but I will not abuse you too much, so thank you.
I'd like to focus on, let's say, a big question, and it was maybe alluded to. It was maybe alluded to, but not really talked about, and that is if you look at the whole period beginning 1928-29 to 1933-34, then what you're looking at is, you know, possibly the destruction of a civilization, a peasant-based civilization. And what I mean by that is, you know, you have people. What do we mean by peasants? We mean people who are small and subsistence farmers, basically. And their whole culture and the whole sorts of morals, the traditions, et cetera, et cetera. So the big question, of course, is what happens when collectivization.
No one can hear.
Okay. The big question then is what happens during this whole period, and there's lots of material on this, and I know working on it in the Reader, for instance, just singing. Kopelev and Lang both mentioned that Ukraine used to be famous for its songs. They heard nothing during this period. So this was something that I guess was a reaction or an outcome of the whole collectivization period and the famine. The question of modernization. I think that we might pose that question a little bit differently. I think Stalin and the leadership was interested in a type of modernization, but a perverse kind of modernization. Collective farms were supposed to be like factory farms, and peasants were supposed to be turned into workers. But what they ended up creating was, I think, a kind of a hybrid monster of some sorts. And so you have elements of feudal, let's say, feudal elements, which the peasants alluded to. They call this a second serfdom. But then you have modernization in the sense of feudalism with tractors. On the collective farms. And if we're looking at social history, having read some of these documents and having read some of the memoirs, if you really want to dig down deep, it gets pretty ugly, really ugly. You not only, if you're talking about cannibalism, it's even who ate whom to survive, or who denied food to their neighbors. And I think also who denounced whom in order to survive. So it gets really, really ugly, but it's also interesting. And finally, I wanted to, I guess, clarify my comment on political correctness. Certainly, if you read the documents, you can see the intent. It's there. You can see the congruence or the intersection of the national and the social questions. It's sometimes very difficult to separate the two. I think that that's why you have to look at it as a complex, as a complex period and a complex, I guess, process. And when I mean what I meant by political correctness is the Soviet elites were, I think, had to speak, or when they did speak, they had to keep to a certain discourse. They couldn't say things that, like, for instance, they couldn't express ethnic hatred per se. but you could express it in the form of accusing someone else of being a nationalist, or bourgeois kulak nationalist, which I came across. So, I mean, I don't know if that's ethnic hatred, perhaps not, but it's certainly an animus towards a national group. Thank you.
I have one short question. I want to expand on something that I asked about yesterday, but I think it's a very important point. It's the question of what happened after the famine, the Holodomor, with the vacuum of several million of people that was created in Ukraine, and the settlement of people from outside of Ukraine to these territories. And I want to ask whether any serious research is being done in the question of how extensive this settlement was, and what were the far-reaching consequences of it, because the research can also indicate indirectly the actual numbers of losses. And maybe researching archives in Belarus and Russia regarding the settlers leaving for Ukraine will indicate how much space was left to be filled by the dead Ukrainian peasants. And also it has impact on the question of memory. It's happened that some of the most monolithically Ukrainian areas that were devastated by famine changed demographically completely into foreign population that was, if you cannot call them collaborators with the famine, they were people who directly benefited from the famine, and as such would be resistant to have any memory of famine as a crime. Because this is my question. I just wanted to toot the horn of my own field and say that it is impossible to understand the changes in the mentality, in the self-national consciousness, without studying arts, without studying literature. And I will suggest to you that it is maybe not the most famous book on the famine, which is Vasily Barka's The Yellow Prince, which doesn't really deal with it, but something that doesn't mention famine. And I would talk to you about the works of Theodosios Machka, who wrote about the 1930s, collectivization of the 1930s, especially his novel Plan do Dworu, which doesn't mention famine, but mentions the complete devastation, dehumanization of the Ukrainian village. Thank you.
Okay, I'm looking over what I've written down. Frank, thank you. Roman, your question was for Serhii. I'm not sure what you're going to say here, but okay. But I would argue that there is a direct connection that famine ensured collectivization. That is, the level of peasant resistance was so high until the Holodomor, and then it just drops off. And I think, and of course, I don't do research in this area, so we really need for other people to be speaking to these issues. But that collectivization was not going to succeed. Well, it didn't succeed, but it wasn't going to become stable in any form without the Holodomor in Ukraine. That is, the subjugation of the peasantry was a critical part of ensuring that collective farms would exist. Let's see. Marco, after the famine settlement to these territories, part of the problem with the numbers that we have, we can't disaggregate them in any way. We don't know if women survived or died proportionally higher or lower to men. We don't know what the proportion is of children. We can't extrapolate what the minorities are. It's very, very difficult to figure out. I mean, we have raw, big numbers, and really that's about it. I think we need a lot more research to figure out whether this whole pattern of settlements and replacement of population, that's a task for several generations. I mean, we've got, I was thinking the other day, we've got like 6 generations of work to do here. long after I'm gone. Like, we really are at the very, very beginning of this. So I don't think the Holodomor, with all due respect, it's not going away as an issue. Whether we want to focus on other things or not, it is going to, I think, dominate Ukrainian studies for a very, very long time. I think I'll stop there.
Well, thanks. I'll start with periodization issue, and it's really thought-provoking idea. I think Frank alluded to that, but I'll maybe develop that a little bit more in a sense that revolting against the 1917 as a turning point in history would mean rebelling not only against periodization accepted by Soviet history or in Western historiography. That would mean also rebelling against a very ingrained tradition in Ukrainian history and historiography, started among others by the father of Ukrainian historiography, Mikhailo Hrushevsky, who treated 1917 very seriously as the head of the Central Rada, was talking and writing about the Ukrainian Revolution as originally part of the Russian Revolution and then going on its own. So from that point of view, again, it's an intriguing proposal. I am all for it, but we'll be having here challenges from more than one side. In terms of the collectivization would not happen or would not succeed rather without famine, I basically support the arguments that were suggested by Olga. What I can say also that the 1932, when you look at the documents, when you look at the sources, official documentation, what you see there is that there is mass exodus from the collective farms. The officials in the official report explain the famine by the fact that the peasants who were forced to join collective farms refused actually to work and refused to sow. And when they start writing who was the first affected by the famine, they're writing that the people who had the less days worked in the collective farm and the peasants with families of with many children. And the lesson that the authorities wanted the peasantry to learn, and at least one can deduct that from some of the comments by Kaganovich, is that the lesson, if you are not in a collective farm and if you don't work, you will not survive. And after famine of 1932, 1933, you see that actually they're getting harvest, which is much better than 1932, despite the fact that the entire countryside was devastated. And the back of Ukrainian peasantry was clearly broken. So the lesson was very clear. Either you're in collective farm and you do your trudodni, or you don't live. And that was the struggle for, among other things, for collectivization. After that, it became irreversible, whatever expectations maybe peasantry had during World War II. Very interesting question about settlement, and Joseph Livesey looked at that when he was at Harvard, looked at the official documents that list the number of households, the number of animals and I don't know, horses and cows and things like that were resettled to Ukraine. Numbers are not big by any stretch of imagination. There was, as always done from the center, there was quotas given to different oblasts in Russia and in Belarus. And then there would be reports that, well, the peasants don't want to go there because they send their own representatives to see what is there. It's a complete disaster. They don't want to go there. So the authorities are issuing orders, preclude the peasants from Yaroslavskaya Oblast or some else, just leave the oblast and go to Ukraine before they're resettled there. Now, the big question is, where are they resettled? Given by the data that we have and that we mapped on, and again, hopefully the connection will work and you will be able to see some of that later in the evening. The hardest hit were the Kyiv and Kharkiv Oblast. When you look where the resettlers are sent, they're sent to the south. The people are taken not only from the Yaroslav Oblast to Vitebsk Oblast, they're taken from the most devastated areas in Ukraine, in Kyiv Oblast, and sent to the south. Why to the south? Because you suggested, and I would believe that the logical way would be actually to send people where most of the people died. They don't care about people who died. They care about the next harvest. The south is the grain-producing areas. The horses, the people from the most devastated areas are sent to the south because they care about grain, about industrialization, about getting hard currency. And then how is this affects or doesn't affect memory? It was a few years ago that Cartografia publishers in Kyiv published a map with these crosses, so commemorative sites all over Ukraine. Well, more or less, it corresponds to our map in terms of where people died the most. We have the highest concentration of the crosses today. And that was also a surprise to me because I am a believer that memory, if not is completely independent of the events, has its autonomy and moves not exactly in the way how things went. But in this case, it's just the footprint of the famine and the map of the commemoration corresponds very, very closely. So thank you.
I'd like to make one modest proposal. Since we're commemorating the famine, can you hear me? I think we should maybe go a little hungry at lunch and add another 15 minutes to the discussions. As many people, I know you originally bristled, Professor Magocsi, against the format, but then we ended up having the front row speak more in the back row. Now, I just wanted to say I couldn't resist this. I know this is the way Olga feels. What Yushchenko did was really wonderful and important, but we really have to, as has been hinted, contextualize that. And I think what he did with that, or UNUPA, was actually, given everything else that he did, was counterproductive largely. And despite Yanukovych and so forth, I think it undermined himself. We have to keep that in mind. Don't make him too much of a hero, although I wish we could. I have a, as far as, I have a modest proposal. Professor Graziosi, and Plokhii, we have the problem of studying cannibalism and so forth. Well, I think we should find funders, preferably from Ukraine, that would produce a TV series about this, of a researcher researching the Holodomor. And it would be a major Hollywood hit if we could get Anthony Hopkins' Hannibal Lecter to be the star of this. He's a very intelligent person. Now, Olga, I want to, as an old colleague, I'm really proud that your talk was second to none amongst many good talks here. And this is, I'm not building you up to attack you, but I did take umbrage at one thing. You made a very big statement about this was the tipping point. The Holodomor killed the Ukrainian peasant culture. And that can be argued, it can be true, but you really have to, it's good as a question at least, you have to really prove it because, well, what percentage of the Ukrainian peasants were killed? I don't know, a quarter, a half, a tenth?
15%.
15%, okay, so there's another 85% left. Obviously there was Soviet regime and what it was doing and the terror and all that, but certainly, probably the culture did exist to some extent. There was this active campaign to Sovietize it, to make good culture begin with Soviet culture, and religious, of course, was thrown out. But that's a question that really has to be looked at, how much and what happened. And I mean, even today, peasants from eastern Ukraine, they won't go to the bazaar on religious holidays, even though the religion has been destroyed. The final thing is, well, two little points. One is, I'm a bit conservative about approach to history. I was also the old school, history really can't be studied until 50 years or so early. Now we're already heading that it's more than 50 years. Obviously, if you were to prove that the Holocaust, if you find documents say, Eureka, only 3 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust, or only 1 million Ukrainians were killed, you would of course be chased out of academia. Instead of being overjoyed that this is, my God, so these people survived, we're so tied into this, we're so, that we really have, we can't have Soviet history and family history. We really have to be careful as historians to really, for me, I think history should be amoral, basically, as much as possible. You shouldn't care one way or the other. That's not, then it becomes publicistics, it becomes journalism, or tends to, okay? You have to really try to get yourself away from that. That's all, thank you.
Hello, my name is Dr. Oleg Pidhainy. I'm that fellow in the front row whom apparently Professor Magocsi doesn't know, which I rather doubt, because I've known him for about 20 years, and he's the same Magocsi that he was, he's still the same. Well, in fact, I think he's one reason why, to a great extent, this conference will have to be considered a failure in the final analysis. Now, the reason for it is very simple. The people who know anything, who have anything like a understanding from at least family stories. Now, I personally survived 2 artificial famines. Now, I was born in the process of one famine. I don't know, my father and mother must have been a little bit wacko that way, but believe it or not, I was, in other words, to have children at the time. That's what I meant, being wacko, So I was born, let us say, basically around 1932, all right? No, I was born right in the middle of the famine, and now that means I must have been conceived sometimes in 31, and that means that the famine was already in the process. So it must be due to the depth of love that my parents had for each other and desire to have children regardless. So when I lived in Kharkiv in my first year, actually there were people dying all around me. And when my mother, you see, in the Soviet Union, they didn't bother with things like giving women much time for pregnancy, you see? And so when my mother, being pregnant and walked the streets of Kharkiv going to work, she was a librarian at the main scholarly Ukrainian library, which was Korolenko Library in Kharkiv. When she was walking to work, she could not afford streetcars. That was for better people. And so she had to walk all the way, which meant she had to walk about an hour to get to work. If she did not make it in an hour, which question? Oh, now you don't want me to speak? I waited long enough. Well, my question is this. Why is a person who has nothing at all to do with survival in Ukraine, coming from Hungarian Ukraine, which was way out west, where nobody even heard of famine for at least 10 years, why is this person chairing this particular conference? Aren't there any people with doctorates, with education, who cannot speak to the famine? Well, now, you see, the problem is, if the whole conference is directed against the question, now how do you get the right to ask a question? Some of you thought that I was very impertinent here, trying to get heard for the last several hours. But believe it or not, the chairman, all the rest of them, saw me all the time, and they know me personally for 20 years. And yet, they could not notice me. Everybody got noticed except somebody who actually survived the famine. Now, I think this is very, very foolish, because how can you, at this point, where can you find somebody right here in this hall who actually survived the famine? How many of them? Has our chairman? No, he was out in the Carpathian Mountains, if he was born. Now, with the other two, ladies and gentlemen, I believe they were from Galicia or something like that. Why not anybody from Kharkiv? Yes. Well, I noticed that some of you do not want me to say anything, and including the gentleman. I don't know your name.
No, you don't.
What's your name?
What's my name?
Your name, last name.
My name is Sissin.
Sissin? Oh, I know you. Not by life, not by sight. I know by your writings. Very strange, very strange. Well, at any rate, ladies and gentlemen, let me point out to you, I want to point out to you one little thing. So far, one of the great failures of this conference is the absence of discussion of historiography and of bibliography. Now, I happen to have prepared a bibliography of about 7,000 titles in Ukrainian and English, and another bibliography that I did with my mother, who was a bibliographer at the Library of Korolenko in Kharkiv. And otherwise, I have also prepared another bibliography. Now, the bibliography I just mentioned is in Ukrainian and English. I've also prepared another bibliography in 5,000 titles, in English, in French. Let's see, what do I have? English, French, German, Italian, which I do not speak, but I can make out the titles. Well, that's about it.
Lunch break?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, what is it? Oh, yeah. Well, at least I was given a chance to say a few words. It took me, believe it or not, 7 hours to do that, mainly because the organization of this conference is in such a lamentable way. And I hope next time it won't be like that.
My name is Gennady Poberezhny from Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. I would like to raise a question about the chronology of the Holodomor as an event. On the one hand, a Ukrainian scholar of the Holodomor, Lyudmila Hrinevich, who will be speaking next panel, has her voluminous chronicles of the collectivization of Holodomor, which is actually on sale over there. But also she chronicles it from 1928 to 1933. And she obviously will speak more about this. But what's important here is that she tries not only raise awareness of the less known famine of 1928, but more precisely looking into the methods that were utilized to much greater degree in 1932, 1933. So that presents interesting question in terms of how far we can stretch it, prior to the events that are being commemorated. On the other hand, working on the Holodomor Atlas project and looking at the demographic data that were provided by the team headed by Oleg Volovina, we can clearly see that the excess death, which were already mentioned here as an important factor in terms of how we sort of define Holodomor, is also those excess losses carried over to 1934. And the losses for 1934 in their totality is almost matching excess losses for 1932. And therefore, from demographic point of view, it makes sense to talk about famine of 1932, or rather Holodomor of 1932, 1934. So for the purposes of the atlas, as we discussed that and sort of preliminary, keep in mind, we sort of set for ourselves that we're looking at the Holodomor from, roughly speaking, August 1932 was the famous degree of which was, we talked about yesterday, until May 1934, when was the we see the level of death basically normalized. So that the question is, should we, use that as as a factor in terms of how we prioritize Holodomor? Also, just a quick observation. In my travel throughout rural Ukraine last year through Vinnytska and Cherkasy Oblast, I noticed that in terms of commemoration, not everywhere, but in some places, more and more, the monument to the victims of Holodomor are sort of incorporated into the already existing memorials to the World War II victims. So they put additional monument in the middle of this stelas with, the plaques with the names who are known, at least those villages who perished during World War II, and this unknown, monument for unknown victims of 1932-34. So that's interesting way trying to sort of incorporate this. And the last point, the minor point, but the principal cartographer of the Holodomor Atlas project, I just want to point out there were actually 8 oblast-level entities, 7 oblasts in Moldovan Republic. Right. You actually showed that on your map. All right, thank you.
I just wanted to make 2 comments about the historical memory and what is happening in Ukraine now, because I think one of the young people did actually ask how come some of this attitude of the young people in Ukraine who are not really interested in the Holodomor. Last week I received an electronic version of the latest textbook for the grade 5 history course. It's written by people who haven't written the textbooks before. The people who wrote them prior to this have not been allowed to continue writing this textbook. There is no mention of the Holodomor in this at all, and it deals with human rights. There are other genocides mentioned, but certainly not the Holodomor, and that has been an intentional policy. The second one that appeared, and I was in Ukraine just a couple of months ago, and it was written by a man by the name of Plokhii, who wrote about the textbook for the grade 11 course. It received the recommendation of the Ministry of Education to be printed, even though the man is on the outs with the present government. And it was published, but the entire section of the 30s, the 30 years, was completely eliminated from this textbook. And the author presented me with this book and told me that he himself had to print this little insert to show that he wasn't the durin that didn't include it. That's what he told me. So, in a sense, when we're talking about people having a historical memory, we in Canada, I've been working for 6 years with the various ministries of education to get the Holodomor into the curriculum. We have to make sure that the students of Ukraine are learning about the Holodomor. And if that's not in the curriculum, then we're not preparing the next generation of students to be capable of continuing the work on the Holodomor and working beyond it and developing a Ukrainian historical consciousness and a memory. The second thing I wanted to mention, while I was there, I spoke to a number of people. I taught in Ukraine for 16 years, teaching teachers how to teach history. So as a result, I deal with all these pedagogical institutes, and I deal with universities that prepare teachers. Every teacher in Ukraine has to go for additional qualification courses every 5 years. They have introduced a genocide course now in Ukraine. Interesting. Other genocides will be taught, and there are special methodology courses for other genocides. Not one of these institutes is going to have a course on the Holodomor. What irony. That's right, positive history. So I'm just showing you the kind of measures that are going on. Despite all the Yanukovych pronouncements that the state will be actively commemorating the Holodomor this year, the actions do not speak the same thing as what is being said. And I think that explains a lot as to what future generations will know about the Holodomor. And the present Minister of Education certainly is not interested in the Holodomor. Thank you.
Thanks. I wanted to thank Gennady in particular for these questions, and we are certainly struggling with some of them. And One thing that is absolutely obvious, that the famine of 1932-33 was the worst in the areas that were hit by the famine of 1931-32. So there is a clear correlation in terms of the number of victims, at least to a degree that demographers can figure this out. With 1934, they're given us the numbers that in terms of the victims match 1932. At this point, we don't have a credible hypothesis on basically what that means or where it occurs. On rayon levels, we have data only for 1933, so not 1932. We have on the oblast levels. And dynamic in terms of oblasts and regions is different for 33 and 34. So it's, but again, this is something to be researched. So I'm not sure whether for example, my personal opinion, whether we can push it all the way to 1928, because there was 29 and 30 in between, but certainly starting it with famine of 1931-32, and then according to demographers ending with 34 seems to be certainly a plausible proposition. And in terms of textbooks and Yushchenko, and I was one of those who basically started with criticism of basically president who lost credibility doing these things and passing on this lack of credibility to also his initiatives. But I would also want to say that the jury is still out there, and the sociological polling is only happening right now to take a look at what these policies had in long term for the change of Ukrainian society, the way how they think about Holodomor, how they think about World War II, and their attitude toward language. So the story is not over yet. So the immediate reaction, we can see that it was a spillover of this negative rating of Yushchenko on his initiatives, but the long term we still don't know that. And the fact that despite of all the problems that Pani Valentina just mentioned, the fact that Yanukovych after this 2 years turning into a different direction is also a very interesting phenomenon. Thank you.
You have anything?
Yeah, I'll just say I always appreciate being corrected by demographers who know what they're talking about. There is a difference, I think, in what happens in the winter of 32-33. It's not, it doesn't have to do with demographic losses and famine as much as it does with a particular campaign to deliver the crippling blow and to defeat the Ukrainian counter-revolution, and it's spoken of that way. So it's really the Holodomor of 32-33 is really about a particular set of political practices that were put in place at that time.
Okay, just one comment to finish our session. Hrushevsky passed away in 1934. I don't think it gave him the time to re-reflect the periodization of Ukrainian history. But what I will say is that in the 1920s, he still called the greatest revolution the Ukrainian people had ever experienced 1648. So he didn't really put 1917 quite that high in his structures at that point. That aside, a few announcements on, first of all, one more comment on our session. I think most of you know this, but for those of you who have never looked through the black deeds of the Kremlin, it is due to the Plokhii family, and particularly the parents of Dr. Oleg Plokhii, that we have that very crucial testimony. And this meant a great deal, of course, for famine survivor testimony coming out in English, and I think we all owe a debt of gratitude to them for what they did. Then as to we have a very rich program, as you can see. And in the next hour, we are going to try and use this to our maximum. By the way, we have, on interest in Holodomor, I know I've already counted beyond 100 and are public is still growing. So at least at that sense, here in Toronto, we see quite an interest in the topic.
Can you hear me? Yes. I have a fairly strong voice. I probably should have been the town crier. Be that as it may, I would like to tell you a little bit about the Ukrainian Canadian Research and Documentation Center, which is one of the co-organizers of this conference. But more importantly, I wish to stress that we, the center, were probably the first to make an effort to reach the general public with information about the Holodomor. And in 1982, a group of us, actually in 81 it started, got together to make a film called Harvest of Despair. Some of you may have seen it. And it was made in English, French, Ukrainian, and Spanish. And it's still available in all these languages if you wish to have them. Now, I should tell you that what we did was not scholarly work per se. It was really our annoyance with the fact that we, although we Ukrainians knew a lot about the famine, everybody heard about it. There was a lot of information in Ukrainian. Well, of course, some of you know about this, but there was next to nothing in English, particularly for the general public. So our intention was to make a film that would be shown in schools and on the television. Now, who was this group that made the film? Most of the original members of the then Ukrainian Famine Research Committee are no longer with us. And essentially, none of them were scholars in history. Here, the only one from the original group that I can see is Mr. Bogdan Onishchuk. Get up. Because we went around doing some of the interviews, filming. He is a lawyer. I am a physicist. The other members that I could mention, the first director was Vasily Yanishevsky, who was a professor of engineering. And then there were Vasil Kirilluk, a Canadian-born veteran of the Canadian Armed Forces. There was Petro Smelsky, also a veteran of the Canadian Armed Forces, a dentist, and other people. I don't want to go through everything. Some came in and out that helped out with this, such as the late Andriy Bandera and many others. Professor Isayu was one of the original group. But what I wish to point out that we actually, in an indirect way, had an influence on the research. Professor Graziosi mentioned yesterday that a Ukrainian monk was one of the first to go to the archives of the Italian Foreign Ministry to dig out information about the famine. Why did he do that? Well, we, that group, first checked which countries had consulates in Ukraine. And one of them was, of course, the Italian one. And it was the most easily accessible, because some of the others at the time weren't even open, like the British and the Vatican, for example. So I knew that the monk in question, his name was Porfiry Pidruchny. He was a Ukrainian born in Brazil, and he was in charge of the publishing division of the Basilian Fathers, who did a lot of very interesting research.